Okay, Sarah, what's your fifth and final tip, please?
So my fifth and final tip, which sort of builds on that, actually what we just spoke about, is that retrieval practice is worth investing time to understand and use. And I think that there's almost been a little bit of a kind of fad around retrieval practice, and I just really wouldn't want it to kind of dissuade people from actually using it. There's some brilliant work out there about like how to use it in primary and secondary. Kate Jones's work is fantastic on that. And I think that for my MA, I tried to get under the hood to understand why it works, and it's just convinced me even more that it's like a really worthwhile strategy to use. So retrieval practice, just for anyone who isn't sure, is low stakes testing. So instead of getting people, say, to like reread their notes on something, you would give them some kind of low stakes questions to check their understanding. And what it seems to do is just enormously powerful for the brain. So whereas when you reread something, you're telling your brain, like, this stuff is available in the environment in the future. It's always going to be there. You don't need to commit it to memory. Reread it. When you retrieve from your memory, you're telling your brain, I am not going to have access to this material in the future. If you don't want to go through this effortful process of trying to retrieve again, you will store it better. And then your brain kind of complies and does that storage. So that's one way in which it's really powerful. It kind of speeds up that storage consolidation process in the brain. And another way it does it, which is just super cool, is like when you retrieve something, you're not just taking something out of your brain and then slotting it back in again. You're fundamentally changing the way that you understand something. You're combining it with new context cues in your environment, depending on how you retrieved it. You're also like changing the schema that you've got in your brain. You're making further stronger connections to other knowledge, weakening connections to knowledge that's less connected. So you're actually changing the landscape of your schema through retrieval practice, because it's effortful and it does these kind of gorgeous things. It kind of elaborates the memory trace and connects it with other things and curates connections with other things. So it's doing loads of dynamic things when you retrieve information. So that's why I think it's really worth investing some time in like how you can use it properly and understanding the conditions that it works really well and factoring it in to teaching. One thing I would say is that there's been quite rightly lots of pushback where people have said, you can only retrieve stuff the pupils have actually sort of understood in the first place. Where is all the thinking about how we kind of get them to understand and make meaning from stuff in the first place? So that's obviously a really important piece. But I'm just talking about retrieval practice here. Once you have taught that stuff, the retrieval seems like a really good way of not just strengthening that memory, but connecting it and changing the connections with other memories as well.
Oh, this is brilliant. I love a bit of retrieval. So let's dive into this. So I'm going to start with a big name drop. I always chuck this in any time. When I had Robert and Elizabeth Bjork on my podcast many years ago now, actually, I asked Robert, or Bob, as I like to call him these days, I said, what is the biggest misconception people have about how memory works? And he said exactly what you've said. People think that accessing a memory is like trying to find a Word document on your computer. You go through the folder structure, you open the Word document, or an image is a better idea. You open an image on your computer, you look at it, you close it, and then you go about your day. And his point there was the next time you want to access that image, you do exactly the same thing. You go through, it's still in the same place, it hasn't changed. Whereas, as you say, the human brain doesn't work like that. And I like the Bjork's phrase that retrieval is a memory modifier. I think that's really, really, like a really strong phrase to bear in mind. So I really like that. My question to you is kind of a two-part question. So the first part of it is, what are examples, knowing what you know about retrieval, that you see in the classroom where retrieval isn't done properly, isn't the right word, but not done as effectively as it could be? And whilst you're thinking, I'll give you one that I see a lot, right? So this is your classic starter. The starter, or the do now, seems to be like the go-to place where retrieval happens in the classroom. And it makes sense because it can be certainly in maths, you can do like some standalone retrieval things in that starter that perhaps don't connect to the rest of the lesson. So a good example here is something like, I don't know, transformations. You want to do a rotation. It's quite hard to kind of interleave that in with other areas of mathematics. So let's do a standalone retrieval opportunity. Let's do that at the start of the lesson. But here's where it goes wrong. the kids don't take it seriously at all. So I've seen kids, good kids in the sense that, they generally work hard. Whilst this starter or doing hours on the board, they're just sat there having a bit of a rest. Maybe they're copying down the date or the title or something like that. And I go up to them and I say, what are you doing here? I say, oh, well, it's just a starter. And they think that this is something that the teacher's just putting on the board for a bit of a laugh, maybe whilst they're doing the register or something like that. But so there's two bad sides to that. Issue one is the kid obviously hasn't learnt anything, even if they then copy the answer down or whatever. They haven't done that effortful retrieval that you speak of. But the other more subtle downside is the teacher thinks that they've provided a retrieval opportunity. So they think, oh, brilliant, well, we've retrieved rotation. We did that 3 weeks. I taught it in 3 weeks. I've retrieved it now, so I can forget about that for a few months. So I call this the illusion of retrieval, the fact that just because something's there, you think that the kids are getting all these benefits from retrieval, but if they're not putting the effort in, it's a waste of time. So that's something I see, and I particularly see that in the starter. I think there's something about the start of the lesson, because it's busy, kids are arriving at different times, maybe the teacher's handing out notices and stuff. Something about the starter that I don't think it's the best place to do this retrieval. But that's just one thing I see. What do you see, Sarah?
That's really interesting. I can see how that would happen. If it's not taken serious, it's like this is just the first 5 minutes. We're all kind of coming
and those
in
kids. Sorry to interrupt you. What's the interesting thing? Those kids who do that, whenever the lesson in inverted commas starts properly in their eyes. So when the teacher says, "All right, today we're going to be doing this," they sit up, the pens are ready. That's when they're attentive. So it's like they think it's some kind of warm up or something like that. It just fascinates me.
No, that's really interesting. I hadn't kind of realised that, but it makes perfect sense that would happen. And then of course they're not doing any retrieval in that
exactly
time.
Right.
And even worse, the teacher might be thinking, yes, we've achieved something here, which is really bad. That's a great one. I'm going to add to my bank of things that go wrong during retrieval practice. We talked about a couple of them. So I think one thing that gets really missed out is the what. What are they retrieving? Why are you choosing that to retrieve? Like, is it the most important thing that they could be retrieving? If we see retrieval as activating knowledge, then would it be best to kind of use that retrieval and link it into the lesson? So would that knowledge be better to be linked into the topic of that you're going to be teaching? Often you see kind of retrieval practice questions are sort of quite random, and that's I say random. They appear random, but the teachers often thought, well, I'm spacing, so I'm dragging this up from another topic, but it doesn't relate to the lesson. And I guess my question is, and I don't know the answer to this, but my question is is part of what makes retrieval practice at the beginning of a lesson potentially effective is that it reactivates some of the knowledge that is useful for that lesson, in which case if we're doing this wild spacing thing, then is that better in homework, and actually we then have it's something that leads into the lesson. So that's my what question there. The effort and success thing is interesting. We want to balance effort and success. Retrieval practice is a desirable difficulty. Yeah, you know the Bjorks much better than me.
My good friends.
Bob and Liz. Yeah, I love that. By the way, I love that podcast. It was one of my favourites that you did with them. And I think that effort and success thing is potentially a kind of a difficult one to achieve, because we also want to be motivating for pupils, especially at the start of a lesson as well. So we probably want to make it slightly more on the success side with some groups, but generally speaking, around a kind of 75% correct kind of benchmark is probably providing, the research suggests, a kind of about right balance between effort and success. But that's not perfect, and it obviously depends on your group. And I think that's where we get the kind of research as a compass thing, because you know your group, and if getting a quarter of the answers wrong in the start activity is going to be hugely demoralising for them, we might want to actually hit it more like a kind of 90% success rate to get a bit of effort and a bit of success. The other thing that's really cool about retrieval practice is if we're going for success rather than effort, we can provide cues, because that's how the brain works. We love a contextual cue to kind of trigger our memory. So if we go round and we're looking at how they're answering the questions, and we're like, Question 3, they're just like, they're not nailing this one. We can always go on the board and put up a word that's going to trigger their, trigger their memory for it, or drop in a few hints some way or another, and that can kind of boost the success there. The feedback one is interesting, I think, because I think generally speaking it's a very good idea to give the feedback, but obviously feedback's its own realm, isn't it? And we could say, "Oh, give feedback after retrieval practice," but are they paying attention to the feedback, Craig? What are they doing with this feedback to kind of internalise it? So that's its own kind of realm of, are you doing the feedback? Are they paying attention to it as well? But that seems like a good bet for making sure they're not strengthening the kind of the wrong answers, I guess.
That's interesting. Just one thing on this. If we just jump back to the starter just temporarily, and the reason I'm a bit obsessed with that, I am obsessed with starters. I'll just throw that out there. Every lesson I'm lucky enough to watch, I'm fascinated by looking at how the teacher starts the lesson, and as I say, particularly what the kids are doing whilst that's happening. So what you see in maths, and I'm interested in your perspective, both as an English specialist but also as a retrieval expert. This is your two hats I need you to have on, Sarah, during this ramble, if that's okay. So what you often see 3 types of, in inverted commas, retrieval style starters in maths lessons, in my experience anyway. So one, you definitely get the kind of, that looks random, but as often kind of built in with spacing in mind. But crucially, as you say, it's 4 kind of disconnected questions. They're not related to each other, and they're probably not related to the rest of the lesson. And the logic behind teachers using those is spacing. They're making sure that they bubble up things that are learned in the past. Now, I've never thought before that perhaps they're best suited to a homework, because maybe it's advantageous to have things that connect to the lesson that's coming up. So that interests me. But you definitely see these kind of standalone starters, and I'm not convinced kids take those all that seriously, just generally. The second thing you see are kind of prerequisite knowledge checks. So maybe you'll have those 4 questions, or maybe it'll be diagnostic questions, but crucially they will be designed to assess, that baseline knowledge that the kids need in order to kind of build the new knowledge on. And that tends to happen more often than not at the start of the topic unit. And you'll often get teachers who intersperse the 2 types there. So they'll have the start of the topic unit, their starter will be on prerequisite knowledge, and then lesson 2, they'll revert back to one of these kind of 4 disconnected starters, and so on and so forth. But the third one, and I'd say this is probably the most prevalent in maths lessons, but I'm interested in your view on this, as I say, both as an English specialist and a retrieval expert. Have you seen that last lesson, last week, last term, last year framework? So this is used loads in maths, and again, this almost seems to do the best of all the worlds if the kids take it seriously, because the last lesson is kind of your prerequisite knowledge, and it kind of triggers what they're going to be doing this lesson, and then you get kind of tapping into what we know about kind of spacing schedules, in the fact that last week has been bubbled up quite quickly, something from last term there's been a longer gap, something from last year there's been a longer gap. So I quite like that, but I'm interested in your take perhaps on those kind of 3 structures, the randoms, the prerequisites, and the last lesson last week, if any of that kind of triggers anything in your mind.
Yeah, wow, it's great. I love how quickly you can kind of categorise those, given how many lessons you've seen. That's amazing. I mean, the short answer is I don't know what's best. So I'm using research as a kind of compass here.
Sure.
So the prerequisite knowledge checks feels to me like a great way to kind of to check for understanding and to warm up that knowledge that's then going to get built on and used. The last lesson last term, I can see how that seems to maximise spacing, as you were saying. So that seems to make sense. Maybe you leave the last lesson one as the final question, so that's just been reactivated before they go into it. I don't know.
That's good. That's nice.
I wonder with that, whether that is a proper warm up for the lesson, or whether it is doing something different, which isn't going to necessarily, whether it's too much interference almost to do that. I don't know. Also, I am guessing at the fact that warming up the knowledge would be the best thing to do in that starter activity, but I think it's a reasonable guess, given how how the brain works. So I think number 2 or number 3 sounds like those kind of best bets, as you were saying, for us there. But it is a difficult one to say. What I also say is we think a lot about retrieval practice, and sometimes we forget that all lesson is like all of the lesson is pretty much retrieval practice in many ways. Like any cold call question we ask, we often don't let them look at their notes to do it, unless we've got insane displays on the, next to them that they can look at. They generally speaking are retrieving for a lot of the lesson. So if we decide that the start activity is actually better for them to read a short passage which will guide them into the learning for the lesson, we can still build in retrieval at different points. That don't necessarily mean we have to kind of pack it in that first 5 minutes, especially as you said, Craig, because sometimes they don't take those 5 minutes necessarily as seriously as they should, or they come in late or something like that. But yeah, I go for 2 and 3 there, just as a kind of best bet.
I like it. And shift one to a kind of homework, because the thing I don't know if it's true in English, you often get some topics that they aren't prerequisite for any new topic, if that makes sense. So again, rotation's a good one. Rotation's kind of a bit of a standalone topic in many senses. So once you've taught it once, unless you schedule in some retrieval opportunities, it's not really going to bubble up all that much like fractions would do or something like that. But I like that idea of shift. Well, I like two of your ideas. I really like the idea of shifting those to standalone, and then maybe making that last lesson last week, shifting the last lesson onto the last thing. I might experiment with that. That's good.
I think a great way that people are organising their curricula now is allowing for this stuff to happen through like organising it around concepts. So I know a lot of kind of English teachers that are thinking about having a sort of concept-led curriculum, and then you can kind of like pull the concept through quite a lot of lessons and have that retrieval around the concept. So sometimes in English and potentially other subjects, that seems to work quite well as well.
Fascinating.